It's wonderful to see all of you here. We're here for our Tuesday talk, and happy May. We were commenting that, just this morning and yesterday and after the weekend, where we were soaking with rain, all of a sudden the sun comes out, So we had to make some special calls to make arrangements for the sun to come out and shine on all of us, but here we are. Welcome to Tuesday Talk. As you all know, that we have this event every Tuesday, or most Tuesdays, where we discuss a topic that is top of mind for people. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what it takes to create a successful biotech company. And we have somebody here who is an expert at that. And he's actually also, it's really wonderful because he's also a resident here at Cure. And so what we have is actually Greg Moss. Greg Moss is the Chief Strategy Officer, Corporate Strategy and Legal Officer, as well as the Corporate Secretary and Chief Compliance Officer of Evommune. So Evommune is a biotech company that is inventing new ways to treat inflammatory diseases, not just treating the symptoms, but actually working on preventing the progression of the disease, and which I think is like revolutionary. And so this is what we've been talking about throughout on all of our Tuesday talk, is how do you move from sick care to well care, and how can you intercept something before it actually turns into a disease and you treat symptoms. And so, we're really, really, really happy that you're here. And just a little bit about Greg, and I think there's a few other members of the Evommune team here. So prior to Evommune, you served as the Executive Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary and Chief Compliance Officer at Cadmon.
I did.
He wears many hats, right? Very versatile leader.
It's a shame to cover up my hair.
Yeah, exactly. And Cadmon was a Sanofi company, and he led legal compliance and business development operations, and that culminated actually in Cadmon's successful $1.9 billion acquisition in late 2021. And so you helped to lead Cadmon's integration into Sanofi, and during that time, and that was a decade-long tenure, right? You were there for about 10 years, served in various roles, and lots of different things involved in that integration, partnering financing activities, transition from a private company to a public company, helping raise more than $1 billion in debt and equity, and business development efforts. So you've done it all. And then spinning off its gene therapy platforms, and then various international and domestic collaborations, license, co-promotion, distribution. So you are a walking expert on how to set up a successful biotech company, And so I think then afterwards you established and helped establish, I should say, the corporate governance and the public company and healthcare compliance program at Cadmon. And before that, you were a solicitor in the corporate risk department in a large Australian law firm. And so you're originally from Australia, and you serve on many boards, and very talented. And so thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Where does the word or the name of the company Evommune come from? Or is it Evommune or Evommune?
So it's Evommune, and at our company, if you say Evo, you've got to put $5 in the swear jar, so you're up to 3. So
I'm up to 3.
Thank you for that investment. We appreciate
it.
The founders of the company, Louis Pena and Jean Bauer, came up with the name a couple of days after they consummated the sale of their last company, Dermira, to Eli Lilly in early 2020, with a desire to really establish a name that projected what the company's vision was, and that was to evolve the future of immunology. So that's the genesis of the name, and I think we live that every day in how we're building our pipeline and how we think about building the organization.
So let's talk a little bit about that. What does evolve the future of immunology mean? I mean, does it have to do with going beyond just treating symptoms?
I think that the way that we think about drug development and a centering for us is going back to a couple of core tenets. And I think if we look at drug development in general, I think efficacy and safety need to be baseline. But we look at developing programs that can reach more patients earlier on in their treatment continuum. We don't presume to be able to prevent disease. I think that we know where we stand in the big picture, but if we can get the disease earlier, we can then have a profound impact. And if you think about inflammatory diseases in particular, inflammation is ultimately a cause long-term of a number of potentially fatal outcomes. But if you look at some of the diseases, they probably don't get the attention of diseases, for example, like cancer and others, where people think, wow, that's fatal. So if you look at atopic dermatitis as an example, if you can get to those mild to moderate patients earlier on and have a profound impact on their disease, you can prevent them from progressing to moderate or to severe, prevent ultimately a huge cost to the healthcare system. But most importantly, you can then stave off some of those comorbidities that might come along later on the path as a result of the inflammation that caused that original atopic dermatitis.
So why do you think that inflammation and immune-mediated inflammatory diseases don't get the same attention as cancer, for example? Is it just the lack of understanding, people not, or is the disease too like widespread and it's like got multiple manifestations of the same biological disturbance?
So it's a big question. I'll do my best to answer. I think that over the last couple of weeks, I&I has certainly got the attention. I think there's been a wonderful foray of big pharma into M&A in the space. A lot of money spent, which is wonderful. It's getting recognition for those at other companies that have been working on inflammatory diseases for a long time. I think the therapeutic development of inflammatory diseases and immunology in general is in its adolescence. And if you think about the last 100 years of cancer treatments, the evolution has been profound. Starting off with surgeries, going through chemo, et cetera, moving on to monoclonal antibodies, moving all the way through to precision medicine today. That's about 100 years of work. Don't quote me on that, but I think when we look at inflammatory diseases and immunology, we're at our earliest stages. Some of the drug development there is only decades old. I read an article recently that said something like it takes about 30 years from research paper to drug development. And when you think about that, if it's only been happening over the last 10 or 15 years, the focus has shifted a little bit in academic research towards inflammatory diseases. I think it starts to make sense now that you're seeing a focus and a shift towards those inflammatory diseases. Importantly, I think people are recognizing more and more the role that inflammation plays ultimately in the cause of some of these other diseases, including cancer.
Yeah, I mean, because that's one of the big things that has happened in the past decade or less, which is the realization of the effect of immunology and immune therapy, on cancer, and that the two are related. So, switching gears a little bit, this is a company. How old is the company?
2 years.
2 years, and you've learned a lot in your career about what it takes to set up a successful biotech company, right? So, what is it that sets companies apart? And like for example, Kadmon was a success story, right? What was it? What was the secret formula there?
So I think Kadmon had a successful outcome and a happy ending in that it was afforded the opportunity to go really, really deep with one of its programs and get a drug approved. I want to just point out that for the people that worked there, that was the achievement. The achievement was getting a drug approved and getting that drug in the hands of thousands of patients and ultimately having a profound impact on their quality of life.
Yep.
And I think certainly then transitioning and handing the baby over to Sanofi to take to the world was not an easy thing to do, but again a wonderful outcome and an outcome again for patients, because Sanofi's reach and the ability for them to get that drug to more patients across the world was something that weighed heavily on the management team at Kadmon. I think ultimately it's about culture. I think that the place had a resilience, it had a strength, it had an ability to overcome, and that drove its success. I think if there was ever a wavering in the self-belief of the people that were behind Kadmon from its establishment all the way through to the end, that would have been its downfall. But there was never a wavering. There was transition of people, but the kind of core, the core mentality and the way that people banded together in the tough times, I think ultimately saw it through. And as we think about Evommune and as we think about how the Evommune management team has come together, our CEO, Luis Pena, from the outset was absolutely adamant that he was going to bring in people who were mature, who had resilience, who knew how to ride out the battle scars and were able to overcome them. And if you look at the team that we've built, we think we've got each of the key verticals that are required to be a successful biotech company. We've spent the money early on to recruit talent that other biotech companies might wait till later on in their life cycle. But we have a very, very slow hiring process. It's really, really slow. We make sure the vetting process is significantly more than just looking at people's resumes. It's really trying to understand their personalities. You're not going to get asked in an Evommune interview, what does this line mean on your resume? But you might get asked, what your favorite thing to do is on a Sunday morning, right? Because those are the things we believe go towards character. And if you can develop character and you can use that as your core filter, you'll have a great culture. And ultimately, we think that having a great culture is the way to drive great science forward. And you need to be a science-driven company if you want to be successful in biotech.
That's really great because you said 3 or 4 key things there, right? One, you talked about strategy and purpose. So the purpose being that it was not about the money and how much money you made. It was about the number of patients whose lives you had an impact on. And then giving up your quote-unquote baby to a bigger company, not an easy thing. But at the end of the day, it was about purpose and making it available to reaching more people, right? So you talked about purpose. Second, you talked about a purpose and strategy sort of go a little bit hand in hand. Second, you talked about culture, the importance of culture. Third, the best science. It has to be a science-based company because at the end of the day, science is a means to achieve the outcome, which is to save people's lives. And then fourth, you're talking about the importance of people, not just their skill sets, but it's not just about the what, it's about the how you do it and about resilience, right? So speaking of all of that, right, let's take them one by one. Let's talk actually about purpose. Why is purpose so important? Because anybody here who wants to start a company, it's not just about starting a company. Why is purpose so important?
I think you need to have a motivation that goes beyond just your personal career ambition, your personal wealth. You mentioned before that I cut my teeth in a big law firm in Australia, and in the 3 years that I worked there, I remember thinking only about ensuring that I clocked the adequate amount of hours to meet my baseline, to then clock the adequate amount of hours to achieve my bonus. And it was in the middle of, I think, working on a mining transaction that fell apart that I recognized I wasn't long for that world because I didn't care about the outcome of the transaction. I cared that I'd build the right amount of hours and then I was going to get the recognition for that. And it was in that moment that I realized I needed to be doing something I was more passionate about. At the time, I didn't know what that was or what it looked like, but I knew that my future lay in the business, not as a service provider. But then, I work with service providers all the time, and they live every single punch with us. Mm-hmm. I just wasn't cut from that cloth. So I think as people think about starting a biotech, their motivation absolutely needs to be something that they're passionate about. If it's not something that they're passionate about, if they're just going into it because they think that they'll be able to ring the bell at the NASDAQ, or if they're going into it because they think it might be a way to pay for their kids to go to college, I think they're going to fall short and they're never going to be satisfied. So it ties directly into culture. I think it ties directly into the type of people who work in biotech, and I think the vast majority of you do. It's not an easy industry to be in. We get both ends of the spectrum. We get everyone who says, "Wow, that's super altruistic, that's super noble, amazing that you go in and work in early stage, high risk places," and then you get criticized when you get the reward, right? But you never ever get asked, "Well, why did you get into it? What was your motivation?" And I could tell you my moment of why I decided long term I wanted to be in biotech was in probably 2017, 2018 timeframe. Cadmon held an advisory board with KOLs who came in to talk about chronic graft-versus-host disease. which was the disease that Cadmon ultimately got a drug approved for, Rezurock. And I'll never forget one of the KOLs who was an oncologist and a transplanter, who he talked about the journey of one of his patients and how the patient had gone through an advanced blood cancer, I think leukemia. They'd received a stem cell transplant. They had finally recovered from their cancer. They'd been cured from their cancer, and then the graft attacked the host, the graft attacked the body. Usually, in most cases, the transplant is rejected by the body, but in those small subset of patients who develop chronic graft-versus-host disease, it works the other way around. And he said this line, and I remember feeling the hairs on my arm stand up, and I remember he said, we keep them alive, and we've given them life, but they don't have an opportunity to live, because they then are put in a situation where they're housebound, they can't go outside, they struggle to do up their buttons, put on their pants. And I remember just thinking, wow. Holy moly, wow, that was my moment. And I knew then and there that regardless of the outcome of Cadmon, and it took years, that this was an area that I wanted to play in, and this was an area where I felt like I could be passionate.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the second thing you talked about is, and I'm going to combine the two, science and strategy. So science on its own, I think, is wonderful, and it's the solution, the path towards cures. But on the other hand, you need strategy for a successful company, right? Talk a little bit about why those two are important.
So I think that research for research's sake is super important, right? We've talked early on about how sometimes ideas and hypotheses that are, too out there for a biotech or a pharma make perfect sense in an academic institution, and voila, 30 years later, you get a drug, right? So I think you still need to have incredibly aspirational science, and we all, and certainly the team at Evommune, leverage relationships at academic institutions. Our chief medical officer and co-founder was the former dean of the medical college at Stanford, so we have solid relationships there. And at Cadmon, we leverage relationships at Princeton and Yale and others. But then when you think about distilling it into an executionable potential drug development program, you need the pragmatists. You need the person, in our case, Jigger's in the audience, our chief scientific officer. You've got to be able to look to people like that to say, that could actually become a drug.
You are.
This is Jigger, the little guy in the front. You have to be able to say it's actionable, and that could actually be a drug. And the building blocks of a good biotech company are knowing who to advance the ball to. So it's not just about having a great research team. It's then about going to your CMC folks, your preclinical and toxicology folks, your pharmacology folks, and all working cross-functionally to be able to then go to a BD person or to a commercial person and say, does this make sense? And investors, with the utmost of respect to those who are in the room, they want companies to have the answers for each of those steps when you may very well be just at the beginning, right? And so, we talked a little bit before about, why I think Evommune is different. It's not different to all biotechs, it's different to many, because I think our CEO and the board recognized early on that we'd need to invest in each of those key verticals really, really rapidly, because if we were going to advance a pipeline of 3 or 4 programs from the outset and try and de-risk those programs, the best way to de-risk it is to have people who have been there and seen it before, because if you are going to fail, and you will in biotech, you want to fail fast so that you can move on to the next thing. But constantly stay true to your mission. And if you can stay true to your mission and you're committed and resilient and you've got the right kinds of people, you will find success.
That brings me to people, right? I mean, a lot of times people may be not just investing in science, but investors are investing in people. And the people part of it is really a key fundamental thing that sets companies apart. Talk a little bit about that and why that is so important.
So I think internally, it's well understood across industries that having a great culture with great people working together is incredibly important. I think perhaps over the last couple of years, you've seen a significant development on the soft science around that, so creating workplaces with psychological safety, places where people can challenge, where fables like the emperor has no clothes don't matter. People have to challenge it, right? And challenge up and down and all around. I think in science, historically, that's existed, right? I remember walking into research meetings in the early days of Cadmon and watching scientists argue and debate, and essentially it looked like a law school moot court, right? Yeah. But then they would walk out and they'd be joking about things. It hasn't been acceptable in finance, in business development, in legal departments, compliance departments historically. So I think having the right kind of people who know that everybody has the same end goal is very, very important, because then you can walk out of those meetings, and similar to a tennis match or something where you may hate the person on the other side of the net, but the game's over, you shake hands and you go and have a beer, right? And I think it's the same in a biotech company. So that's the internal piece. The external piece, I think more and more VCs and investors are looking to identify talent in more than just scientific acumen. I think they're looking to people who they feel have the fire in the belly to go through those topsy-turvy moments in biotech, but also, I think most importantly, the capacity to say we don't know, or to ask questions, and to go to their relationships and go to the KOLs and establish networks of people in industry. And certainly early on in my career, that was something I did. I cut my teeth in commercial and pharma compliance, and I developed a big network of folks in that space. And in the early days of Cadmon, as we were growing out a commercial infrastructure, preparing for launch, I went back to all those relationships and I said, hey, what do I need to do here? Do you have any advice? And people are wonderfully forthcoming in this industry because we all have the same goal. And that goal is improving patient lives, right? Improving patient outcomes. And so, I think that if you can set ego aside, if you can set pride aside and know that the person you're having an argument with on your executive committee meeting or at your project team meeting, their goal is the same, then, and compliance hat on, which is where, again, I spent some of my earlier career. Historically, compliance was a police person, right? Yeah. They were the enforcer, right? But if the compliance person's goal is the delivery of safe and effective treatments for patients in a compliant way, and then that's the exact same set of facts that the CEO has as their centering, that somebody in the research group, somebody in the clinical group has, then you should be able to find alignment. You've just got to work through it. Yeah. So it's a long way of saying I think people need to have the ability to express themselves and an understanding that there's a common goal. And if you have those two things, and there's no, you're not creating environments where people are afraid to speak up, where people are worried about being embarrassed by a question. Yeah. If you can get rid of all of that, I think you're going to have a wonderful success. And it's not easy. Yeah. I don't think people should have be afraid to set things like timelines and deadlines. People should absolutely have fear of those deadlines. What they should not have fear of is a conversation about how they get set. Yeah. Right, and whether or not that was reasonable.
Yeah. It's interesting because you talked also about resilience and the importance of resilience. But the other thing you're also saying is that it doesn't matter. It's not just that the scientific team is the only one that has that end goal of saving patients' lives. It's also the non-scientific teams, right? And so I wanted to just talk to the scientific team member from your team, Jigar. So how do the team dynamics actually affect the ultimate outcome? And how do the scientific teams and the non-scientific teams get along, align around the purpose?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that we kind of worked through at Cadman. I mean, we tend to share a lot of the science with everyone else within the organization. And I think that's important, what Greg mentioned. It's about purpose. Where are we trying to get to? And then trying to understand that patient journey early on, even at the point where we're trying to identify what targets to go after, having that background of what that patient journey looks like, what your intervention point may look like, gets everybody on the same page of what we're trying to do. So when you're having a heartfelt conversation about budget or timelines or understanding some of these things, everybody's on the same page of where we want to get to. And a lot of that comes back down to the scientists and their ability to narrate the scientific path of the molecule, the target, where we want to intervene on the patient. And it's work. It's certainly different role than a traditional scientist sometimes plays within a biotech company, but sharing that broad scientific expertise, I mean, people are genuinely interested in it. If they're not interested in a biotech company, it's a little odd.
Yeah.
So they are interested, they're receptive, but it does take work from the scientific kind of community to get that message out there, help people understand why we're doing certain things, why we're trying to fail compounds early. It's not a bad thing, right? Those failure points should be celebrated. They should not be looked at as an overall failure in the strategy or anything to that effect. If anything, if you take something too far and it fails late, that was actually a failure in strategy. So I think that communication really has to be there. It's obviously a little bit simpler from a smaller biotech organization where you've put the team together. We've all been cut from similar backgrounds, but as we bring in new people, that's a lot what we're looking for, is to make sure that these new entries have the curiosity to communicate that science, want to kind of follow through with that overall patient journey and where we want to evolve the immunology space.
That's interesting because, sometimes you find cultures where scientists are like, oh, this is too hard to explain. I'm not going to bother. Just go do your job and, get this thing sold or get us to be compliant.
They say that a lot,
right?
To me, yeah.
But on the other hand, there may be some folks who are non-scientists who might say, oh God, this stuff is too hard to understand. I don't want to understand it. I just want to do my job. And that is not good, right? Like you need to understand. You're not going to let Greg into the lab anytime soon to do an experiment.
He's always welcome, and he can help out if he needs to. We are still small, so we do need some hands.
Yeah.
But at least, the understanding of, some of the basics and, the mechanisms that you're going after, the targets, et cetera, is important to really be good at what you do, right?
Absolutely.
It's absolutely critical. I think, again, it gets everybody on the same page of what we're trying to achieve. And the burden does sometimes come back to the scientists to make sure that they do take the time to really express and narrate that science. It's not natural. I completely agree with you. But it is an important part of growing the company to the point where you are science-based as an organization, not just as a department.
But I think to add on, I think that it's understanding that that's where each of you play a role in telling the story is important. I think that there was some press recently about some frustration of one of the VCs with a CEO that they'd seeded because that CEO had difficulty communicating their story. But when you looked at that CEO's background, we looked at it and said, but that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
This is somebody who's wonderfully brilliant, who's spent their life in a lab. Their expectation should not be that that person go out and win over an investor public through having an extroverted personality or having the ability to caress a timeline to fit within a narrative that the investor public might be looking for. Yep. So there's roles for everybody. They say in legal and compliance world that how did you get into biotech? And they say that one of two ways: you either knew somebody or you fell into it, right? Yep. No one ever says, "Oh, I want to do that." Yep. But you're seeing more and more people say that they want to do that as they look for that passion, that nobility of their cause, their purpose. And there's now more and more of a platform for people. And I'm an example of somebody who always had an interest in moving into the business and finding a way to influence and have impact on the business beyond just establishing a legal and compliance function. I was blessed to have that opportunity at Cadmon at the end, and then when I was searching for my new opportunity and speaking to my networks and introduced to the team at Evommune, that opportunity presented itself, but it was my comfort level in looking to Jigger and looking to Gene and saying, hey guys, can you prop me up here when I'm in the process of telling a story if the questions are significantly more clinical or significantly more scientific than I'm comfortable, and not being worried about my ego or my pride in that moment because it's a team effort.
Yeah, so you can call the lifeline, right?
That's right.
When you have
Call
a question,
phone a friend.
Phone a friend when you.
But it also works both ways. I mean, I will give credit that we are bi-directional, right? So during the fundraising opportunities, it was good for the scientists to hear some of the feedback from the VCs, kind of look and kind of go back, integrate that data into the information and what we want to present going forward. So it does go both ways in understanding both different landscapes in order to move this journey forward.
Yeah. And that brings, so that's where science, strategy, commercial, compliance, everything comes together because it's a full, it's a well-rounded thing that you have all of these pieces. But there's always this sort of dynamic tension between balancing something that is a short-term deliverable, but then keeping your eye on the long term and the end goal, the final prize, right? How do you balance that, especially when you're a small biotech company with limited resources?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. I think, again, culture is important, both in terms of the internal piece, but also in, there's a famous saying, not every dollar is created equal. You want to take investors funding who have buy-in to your vision, and they understand that that dollar may not have an ROI that's in the near term, but at the same time, you're looking to grow value in the pipeline so that you can continue to fundraise, to continue to add, and to develop your programs. And so I think that the balancing act is an everyday thing. It's not something you can look at as binary. I think the big misnomer is that good corporate governance says that a board blesses your budget in January of the calendar year, but then by March it's changed completely, right? And too many times I think rigid, immovable companies fail because they don't know how to pivot, they don't know how to move. My finance folks are in the room giggling at me. But there's an old saying in law that the law is evolutionary, not revolutionary. And it's the same with budgeting, and it's the same with clinical development. Kadmon in its early days had a solid push in non-small cell lung cancer, and ultimately the competitive landscape was able to move faster than we were. So even though we probably would have got a drug approved, by the time that project had moved its way into phase 2, it didn't make sense for us to move it, which is super frustrating for those patients in the early years that didn't have any access to therapy. But as a small company, you only have a certain amount of dollars, and you can only allocate. So huge amount of judgment goes into it. I think having earnest conversations with yourself, having honest conversations with your team, and deciding collectively how to prioritize, and then getting conviction around those priorities is ultimately how you're going to win.
So there's challenges to therapeutic areas as well, right? Does immunology have special challenges that like other therapeutic areas don't have?
Yeah, I think, and Jacob, please weigh in here, but I think typically immunological diseases and disorders have huge patient populations, which ultimately means you need to, over the life cycle of a drug's development, have a huge amount of clinical studies that go into it. Whereas with rare disease, with aspects of cancer, you could probably get fast track approval, you can get breakthrough designation, you can get things that'll allow you to conduct smaller studies. In Kadmon's case, 160 patient phase 2 pivotal study, which had no control arm because it was such a sick patient population. But when you think about atopic dermatitis, or if you think about some mast cell mediated diseases that we're looking at, they're big indications. So companies like Evommune need to be thoughtful about how they get to proof of concept. They then need to factor in all these other things which we're super cognizant of, but at the same time struggle to allocate mind share to think about, like the IRA, like pricing, like the impact of reference pricing in different countries. If you get an approval in country A, and that might be a reference price for country B. These are all the tactical things that big pharma tends to think about a lot and think about really, really well, that small, nimble biotech companies really don't have the ability to. Or if they do have the ability, they don't have the time or the money, right? So there's a balancing act there. I think all of those things go into challenging your researchers to come up with targets that make sense for the organization. And that's not an easy thing to ask of them. So there has to be a patience with a C this time about it as well, even though you're ultimately focusing on patients with the T.
Yeah. Jigar, you want to add anything to it?
I think Greg covered it. I mean, immunology has a unique place, and certainly it's perceived as having a lot of competition within the environment, and there's certainly molecules that have done well by patients. Some of the targeted therapies on certain kind of monogenic-driven diseases have done really well. But there's still a lot of opportunity on some of the more rare immunological diseases, and also getting to these patients at early intervention points. We've certainly seen the biologics be pushed towards later therapies, and that becomes what Greg was talking about, a little bit about access. How do you get access to patients much earlier on, and what are the innovative therapies that you can bring earlier to the mild to moderate population that then will have access to it so that they prevent the progression of the overall disease. The target space is certainly active, and so obviously looking for new innovative targets is no small feat. You see generally people moving in kind of a herdish mentality on certain pathways, and I think you've got to cut your own cloth on how you want to intervene on those pathways that have been somewhat clinically validated, but have intervention points that are novel and innovative.
Jacob makes a really good point about competition, because I think, you know, in areas that we're interested in studying, IBD, ulcerative colitis, AD, there are tons of therapies. But what we are seeing is in the patient populations that aren't eligible for some of these very successful biologics, most of them are being underserved by the existing treatments. So even though there's tons of approved therapies out there, they're getting to 40% of the patients, 50% of the patients. Just because of the way that those drugs were developed, what was understood. So for example, in AD, our hypothesis is that there's 3 key drivers of AD, and most of the existing treatments are getting to hit kind of Th2 adaptive inflammation, whereas we think you need to hit adaptive, innate, and environmental inflammation. And if you can suppress each of them, you can burst through that efficacy ceiling. And we think our lead program, EVO101, targeting IRAK4, can do that. But that's how the hypothesis came about, was to understand, why are most of the existing treatments not reaching enough patients? And I mentioned at the beginning, Evommune centering continues to come back to that. If you can get to more patients, and if you can get to them earlier, you can then have a profound impact on their overall health. And that's what we're trying to achieve.
And the other challenge has been, most of the therapies in immunology have been sort of biologics, right? And which is...
And they're wonderful.
And they're wonderful. Yeah. They're wonderful. But difficult to administer, and there's a lot more to it than just taking a oral pill, right? What do you see as the future in terms of biologics and infusions versus down the road oral?
I think the biologics certainly have changed the space of immunology. I mean, there've been some profound effects on key disease areas. Obviously, dosing frequency has played a little bit of role on the kind of adaptation of that into the clinical environment. But also pricing has played a big role in that as well. And some of the pricing challenges will subside as some of the biosimilars enter the market. I think people are looking at those same pathways and now going after them from a small molecule approach to alleviate the dose administration scenario. And there's certainly some good protein-protein interaction companies out there now going after, again, clinically validated targets, hitting them with a small molecule. I think there's still space. We tend to think of all these diseases homogeneous, right? And so you asked an earlier question about why the efficacy for some of these diseases is not at the level where we see it, like psoriasis, for example, which is very high. I think we're tending to group these diseases as being very simple and single target driven, single cytokine driven, and that's probably just not likely the case. I think the science has to evolve to get us to where we can differentiate some of these patients a little bit more clearly than we are right now.
Any additional thoughts on
that?
I
think it's taking us back to the conversation about the future of immunology. I think as we move more and more to understand how each patient is incurring their disease and understanding the heterogeneous nature of a number of these diseases, you're going to have to tailor treatment. So the healthcare system in the U.S., let's just talk about the U.S. for a minute. The healthcare system in the U.S. cannot fund biologics for every one of these patients. They just can't. So I think that there's going to be a need to push towards small molecules, a need to push towards topicals, and ways that you can treat the full spectrum of patients, knowing full well that for those patients who do get really, really sick, there's wonderful options with biologics. I do think the government has a lot of challenges. I think the IRA has not made it easy for folks, and inevitably, now there's a huge focus again on biologics because they're carved out of the first iteration of the IRA. So, Big Pharma is thinking about timelines to loss of exclusivity and those kinds of things. So you're going to see it be a little cyclical. I think who's in government and what the focus and the lobbies have to say will have a profound impact on some of those decisions. But as we think about what we can control today, we're less focused on modality, more focused on target and increasing our reach in those patients. And if we think it makes sense to deliver a specific drug topically or through a biologic or through a pill, then we'll focus on that modality. But we will let science decide that for us. So for example, if a target like IRAK4 is an interesting target, right? And we think it is. We think that in order for it to have a profound impact on mild to moderate disease, it needs to get to the tissue very, very quickly, but then rapidly clear. And as a net result, our molecule was designed from the outset as a topical. Yep. It wasn't designed as an oral that was then, reformulated. It was designed to achieve that. We never set out to be a topical program, right? Yeah. And similarly with biologics, there's going to be development programs out there that say you've got to deliver it this way. That's going to be the fastest, most effective way for you to have an impact on disease. And cheers to that.
Yeah. One more question on the whole, the immunology being a bit more of a difficult therapeutic area, and doesn't it also have to do a little bit with perception? So you take atopic dermatitis, right? It's like, oh, okay, whatever. You have, these skin things, but you're not dying. Yeah. Like you're dying, and there's many of the immunology diseases that sort of fall into that category, right? And so sometimes it feels like it's a quality of life rather than the life itself, right? How do you deal with that challenge?
So I think that is spot on. I think that perception is a big issue that, as the world, I think, becomes more and more aware that inflammation is likely the cause of a number of these more serious or fatal diseases, they're understanding that. But then the way that I tend to handle it is I ask people if they've ever been itchy before, and whether or not, if they had to itch and scratch the entire night, whether that would have an impact on their mental health, whether that would create a physical impact beyond just a little bit. So, I think the more and more spokespeople that are out there talking about these things, the better. The more and more $10.8 billion I&I M&A that happens, the better. And cheers to those folks. But I think that there's absolutely going to be a narrative. I think, again, scientific publications, clinical meetings where people are speaking about this, and more research that is going into understanding, the impact of fibrosis, the impact of inflammation, some of these autoimmune and genetic disorders that are then ultimately leading to other comorbidities and overall impacts on overall health, the better, because ultimately that'll mean that more dollars, find their way into development in immunology.
Anything to add?
I agree, and I think it comes back to trying to understand that patient journey. So even prior to joining Evommune, I had similar thought process going on because I primarily came out of a background of working on oncology. And then as I entered this immunology space, I had the same question about atopic dermatitis, and I took the effort to go out and meet a parent of a child who had atopic dermatitis. I was 3 years old, and then they walked me through the patient journey of this child. And a 3-year-old with significant atopic dermatitis is no small effort. I mean, it is a full-time management job because you can't just tell a 3-year-old to stop itching and scratching, right? And so this is a full-time effort that they're going through. And I think as we get this message out and as people start to understand the disease and the patient journey a little bit more carefully, they'll be on the same page in terms of understanding the significance of the diseases. I think the other part of it is immunological diseases are a gateway to more severe diseases as it progresses forward. And I think that message has to get out there as well.
Yeah. So one last question, I'll turn it to the audience as well. So if you want to start a new company, what are sort of the things that you must have in place to set it up for success?
It's a great question. I think people around you that you trust, that you respect, and that you can rely on. I think that's the first thing. I don't think you can do it alone. And anyone who's starting out today, even with a significant seed check, will need to then rely on others. And so I think that's number one. Number two, I think you need to have a clear vision of what you want to be when you grow up. And you may not get there, right? And Cadmon was ready to launch its own drug and was excited, but it never got there, and everyone was okay with that. But I think as long as you've got a clear vision and you have the ability to keep your eye on that prize, you'll be able to overcome the inevitable challenges that will come. And nobody likes fundraising. Nobody likes going through the process. Nobody likes, waiting for data and then the data coming out and it not being what you'd hoped it to be. But those are things that are inevitable realities of biotech. So if you're starting a biotech and those things are not at all interesting to you and you don't enjoy the journey, don't get into biotech. But the flip side, if it's about the journey and it's not just about the destination, but you can see the destination, that's how you should be very excited and saying, hey, I'd love to get into biotech. So if I was starting a new company tomorrow, which I'm not because Evommune is just getting started, I would be thinking like that. And I'd be looking to the folks around me to say, how can we do this together? What do we think the next iteration of our journey looks like? And what do we want to leave behind? And I think each of us has worked with mentors over the years who have had different focuses, those that have spoken about patient outcomes, those that have spoken about legacy, those that have spoken about being recognized for scientific acumen and for change. And I think you take the good and you look at each of those factors that motivated you throughout your journey and see if you can find those in like-minded people and partner up and move forward.
And
then, of course, investors.
Investors, yes. But even investors invest in people.
Absolutely.
Right? And the same science, the same strategy, the same company in the hand of team A could succeed, and in the hands of team B
100%.
Could fail. Right? So it's actually the...
I think some of the great drugs, including lebrikizumab, which is in the hands of Eli Lilly today, but which was developed ultimately to the stage that it was at by the Dermira team, was a failed phase 3 drug from Genentech, right? So it's not just about culture. Sometimes it's about priorities. Sometimes it's about decision making, study design. Different people look at things differently. But I certainly believe that culture or a bad culture can prevent great science from progressing. I think there's dozens of stories of people who say, wow, I really thought that company would make it. And then you hear years later somebody's war story about that place and it was really not a fun place to work, or people were being asked to work on things that they didn't enjoy. And then conversely, you hear wonderful stories like your Genentechs, like your Cadmons, where people said, we really loved working there, and they miss. I've heard a couple of our folks talk about playing wiffle ball in the lab at Genentech, and painting each other's cars pink, and stuff that were stories of legend, right? But it's consistent across those organizations who had incredible drug discovery and incredible track records on getting drugs approved, how much fun and how much enjoyment people were having by going to work every day. So I don't think it's about, with all due respect to our pure tech colleagues in Silicon Valley, I don't think it's about having a table tennis table or a pinball machine or a nap room. I think it's about having people who go there, are motivated, and know that they can have fun with each other, take their work really, really seriously, but not take themselves too seriously.
Great. Well, thank you, Greg. This was just excellent.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And to Jager as well.
Thanks, bud.
So let's see if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, okay. Yeah, okay.
I was wondering, especially because I think maybe your VCs are in the room, you've spoken a lot about culture, about this cross osmosis between the scientists, between strategy, between really everyone within your culture. In the beginning rounds in finding funding partners, do you find that you communicate that as part of your vision and have that locked in without potential for that to derail?
Firstly, my CFO's in the room, so he'll keep me honest. Absolutely. I think spending time with the investors, having them understand the team's vision, what strategy ultimately the CEO wants to set in order to execute on that vision, and then getting to know the character of the people is incredibly important for the VCs and the investors. And ultimately, you see investors regularly backing people who have made promises and kept those promises to those investors in the past, even if sometimes those promises were not ultimately successes, because they know that that person will do everything that it takes to get to that end point. And sometimes the end point is that the science just wasn't there, but they got you to that end point. And so, yeah, I think that the venture capital community, the healthcare hedge fund community, and even the generalists, more and more are spending time with teams. In biotech historically, there weren't a ton of repeat success stories, but there has been more and more over the last 10, 15-year period of time. And I think that's because the investor community, which is a crucial part of the biotech ecosystem, has been willing to spend time to back people and back people to have failures and make the mistakes, but back them to overcome them.
That's great. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was very insightful. I'm a CEO and co-founder of Panic Therapeutics. David Bravo was my name. I was wondering, since in immunology, you have so many, and inflammation, it's so broad. You have so many indications that you can go for in the future. You said something very interesting related to what sense makes to start working on a program today that perhaps in 2 years I'll have a vaccine or a drug that will take 90% of the market, so I'll become irrelevant. So my question, it's technical. What's the weight in the decision making of the scientific side versus the commercial side to say this is going to be my first indications to pursue?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Normally when someone says it's technical, I look at Jigger, but I'll do my best. I think that there's no perfect science, excuse the pun, to coming up with that weighting. I do think that companies like ours, for example, need to look at regulatory pathways that may make sense to get to an expedient way to prove the mechanism or prove the concept. I think that's more important in a biotech's early life stage rather than thinking about ultimately what disease this might work for. So typically when we're thinking about it, we're looking at scientifically what makes the most sense. And then let's say that spits out 2 or 3 potential options. We would then look at what's the regulatory pathway for each. So for example, if something's in a really rare disease and we think it'll be incredibly difficult to enroll patients in it, that might be a downside. Conversely, if it's in a rare disease, maybe there's an expeditious regulatory pathway that would make sense, that would justify us going down that pathway. But then the final component is having a conversation with your commercial colleagues or with commercial consultants, because early stage biotechs don't tend to have commercial early on, speaking with them to understand not just what the commercial landscape looks like today, but what does the commercial landscape look like over the next 5 to 10 years. And oftentimes you're asking them to read the tea leaves, but these are all the different inputs into the information kind of spectrum that you need to consider. If it was just about the science, I think it'd be super easy. But again, so many wonderful examples of great science that never made it because the competitive landscape didn't keep up. So that's not a great answer because there's a lot, or it depends, but I think you need to think about all of them. And that's where having cross-functional teams with experience and being willing to ask KOLs and others for feedback is incredibly important.
Yes.
Thank you. So my brother had a similar job with a biotech company in Baltimore, and during COVID, they did some contracting with a big company, and I don't know if you remember what happened there. The manufacturing went bad, and they had to lose all the contract and everything. So, how do you plan for those kind of uncertainties? Like, do you do some kind of scenario planning when you do strategies? And there's so many uncertainties in life.
I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, and I think that I am, we have a very complicated process for vendor selection. So we have complex processes for selecting who's going to make our API, who's going to make our drug product, who's going to become part of our supply chain. It's incredibly difficult to plan for those scenarios where things go into lockdown, where a site gets shut down by the agency, where there's a fire. We're constantly thinking about redundancies. We're constantly looking to risk mitigate. You can never risk mitigate too much. But it's never perfect. Oftentimes, one question you get asked is, do you have a second source API supplier? And 70–80% of small companies will say no. And then they'll say, well, why did you select that one? And you say, well, because that's a really big one. And they've got multiple different factories, so if one goes, they might have another. But it's very hard. And small organizations that don't risk plan or don't think about the downside scenario, I think are making a terrible mistake.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Meeti Kalra, and I work at Makovsky, a PR agency. Your company was started in California, correct?
Right.
What attracted you to New York, and what kind of resources are you finding here? What's missing in New York? And also, what's the life of biotechs in New York from your perspective?
So just to clarify, Evommune was founded in Palo Alto, California, but there are 5 of us that were recruited to join the Evommune team who have always been in New York. And at my prior company, Cadmon, we were in New York. We were just across town on the river for a decade. So I think ultimately the Evommune team's decision to recruit was largely a culture decision and a marriage of 2 management teams and different expertise. So, I think we're long on both California and New York. I think that we see huge opportunity. The work that Seema and her team are doing here is a wonderful example of the potential future of the development and growth of the ecosystem in New York. But New York Bio has been putting tons of effort, and the city and the state have put tons of money behind biotech here. There's a huge amount of investors that have presence in New York. I think we need to acknowledge, our cousins in Boston and our friends in New Jersey and Seattle and California and the Research Triangle in North Carolina. But historically, New York has been a hotbed for great biotech companies. I think there's healthy competition between the two, but we talk to banks, we talk to investors, and they've got teams covering both coasts. And we worked very respectfully amongst our management team to find a balance between who gets the early morning and who gets the late night. But we do it, and it's in terms of what else we can do, I think there's tons. I think there's a huge amount of room for growth, and I think that the investment Deerfield have made with the government support to develop this building is one of a few aspects to that. But the government could continue to fund innovation. They can continue to encourage and make the tech transfer process out of our great institutions here in New York easier. And certainly from your world, the more people recognize and realize that New York City is a great place to work, Palo Alto is a good, great place to work, you're going to see talent attraction, and people want to live in these great cities. Long term, I moved from Australia, and I would say at least half of my attraction was to go and live in New York City. To me, it was big and bright, and it was a massive challenge. So, I think around the world there's plenty of people thinking like that, and you might not be able to compete on everything, but if you can offer up New York City, that's a pretty good part of the package.
The capital of the world.
I think so.
Carla, yes.
One of the issues, thanks. One of the issues that's important in terms of management, in terms of science, and in terms of patients, we all give lip service to it, is health equity. How do you balance that with the priorities of a new company, a small company, and the focus that you have to actually make decisions about?
So it's a really good question. I think ultimately we have to be cognizant of health equity, and we need to be thinking, across the spectrum of potential outcomes for patients. But I also think that there needs to be collaboration between the government and between the investor community, the healthcare, payers, and all the hands in the cookie jar between, the drug company and the patient, to start looking at health equity beyond just these diseases we've been talking about today. So, how do you convince a small, innovative biotechnology company to go after a disease where the patient population is in a third world country and they're never going to be able to pay for it, and you're never going to be able to reimburse your investors with an ROI on their investment? It's a huge challenge, but through partnership and through finding alternative ways for you to allocate that capital, you could do that. So.
With the white male management and science team?
I think you can. I don't see any.
There's not a lot of evidence for it. So, and the same thing, the VC world, it's white male primarily. It's changing and it's growing, but are people really looking at it when you still have to look at ROI and the future of biotechs and small companies and large companies?
Yeah, it's a totally fair question. I think yes is the answer. I think people should be judged on what they're delivering and what they're executing on. But ultimately, I think we were asked a question recently about, and I've seen the same question posed recently at the Stanford Scientific Symposium, which was, does big pharma really care about curing disease if ultimately they would love for patients to be on these long-term, very expensive treatments? And I think that's a total no, in the sense that the response from all of the big pharma CEOs at the Stanford Symposium were like, you couldn't be more wrong. I spent 7 months working within Sanofi, and I was amazed at how much money they put behind D&I, how much money they put behind health equity, how much money they put behind development programs that would ultimately cure, and they're led by a white male. So, I definitely think it's possible. I think we need to continue to work towards being better and being more inclusive, but it's a collective effort. I don't think it's an effort from one area of the biotech ecosystem. I don't think it's just the investors.
It's a conscious effort.
Absolutely.
Because I agree that the white males who are running the VC world, small biotechs, big pharma companies, there's some great human beings who are really trying to push the envelope on this. But we still can see that women and minorities are not in the room.
Yeah, and I think that's an area I think we need to continue to work on, right, in terms of inclusion and gender parity, but also diversity. And I think that so there's 2 or 3 different aspects to it, right? One is the management team and who is in the leadership, and continuing to look at that, and not just in biotech companies, all across, writ large, right? We need to look at that worldwide. Second, I think that we had to also look at the diseases, because we did a whole session on women's health and investments in women's health and the speculum, which has not been innovated since God knows when, right? And so there is lots of issues that we need to solve. But I think the glass is in some ways half empty, and so we have to make it better. But the good news is also that the glass is half full, and that there are very good people who are, regardless of their gender or their ethnicity, are trying to do good in the world. And I think that the recognition of that balance, being pleased but not satisfied, is how we should be looking at the world, I think. And so, but the Rosalind Franklin Society, which is something that you and I talk about quite a lot, has, that's one of the things that we've been trying to do, is to make sure that Rosalind Franklin gets as much credit as, James Watson and Francis Crick. And so, completely a well-made point. But I also think that the glass, while we need to continue to work on it, there is also some good people out there. Well, yeah, we're not done, but there are some good people. Yeah.
No, I
good
think
people
similar
doing good
to
things. Yeah.
the evolution of drug development, the industry is undergoing a huge amount of change, and it's, again, if people have got the same goal, which I think everybody does, then I think we'll get there. But it's not an easy fix, and I recognize your comment, and I don't take it personally. I recognize the privilege and the things that I have just by virtue of being that.
Okay, do we have any questions on the live audience from LinkedIn? Okay. A lot of people? Okay. So I hope we got a lot of likes as well. That's great. Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Greg. And thank you to Jigar and to the entire team from Evommune. Did I say that correctly now?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank
really
you, Seema.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. So, continue to hang out, and, Greg is going to be here, Jigar is going to be here, other members are going to be here. So if you have questions, grab another glass of wine or some chips.